Bava Batra, Daf Kuf Samach Zayin and Kuf Samach Chet. What is being seen can't be unseen. An image can be fleeting, but the imagination that is stimulated by that image takes on a life of its own and can linger on for a long time thereafter. We can use that to our advantage, or it can be a very destructive force. Let's understand the piece of Gemara that we have today. We're talking about a situation where Rav Yomi BAVA, a very great Amora in the second generation of Amoraim, that's a talmid of Rav, is signed on a shovar of a woman. A shovar is a receipt. That means this woman signed a receipt to say she had been paid out her ketuvah after a divorce from her husband. Later on, she comes to the Beit Din and she says, that's not me who was signed on this shovar. That's somebody else. I have not yet been paid out by my husband. Rabbi Yomi BAVA, who is one of the witnesses on the shovar, on this receipt, says, I think she's right. I don't think she was the woman because her voice is different, she looks different. Later on he changes his mind and he says, I realize I've been told she just aged, her voice sounds a little different, and that's natural and normal. It is in fact the same woman. The question is, do we apply the principle of kivin shehegid shuv eno chozer magid? That means that once a person is given evidence, you can't retract the evidence and give new evidence that is different from that which you said initially. And in this case, with Rabbi Yomi BAVA, who's already said that he doesn't think this is the right woman, he accepts her claim that she has not yet been paid, wants to change his evidence and say, I've now been given information which indicates that this is the right woman. In that case, Abaya says, we accept his retraction. And the reason is a very fascinating reason. The reason is because Tzubim Rabbonen lav urchei l'meidak. It's not normal for a Talmid Chochem to take careful notice of the features of a woman. So if a woman came to Beis Din and years later this document is presented again at Beis Din, it's perfectly possible that Rabbi Yomi BAVA didn't take careful enough notice of her features and looks at the woman now who now claims, it wasn't me, I wasn't in front of you, this isn't my document, and it's possible for Rabbi Yomi BAVA, who's a Talmid Chacham, of course, a very great stature, not to be fully aware of it, because as a Talmid Chacham he doesn't look at women that much. That's not something that he does. And therefore we'll allow him to retract. That's the basic piece of Gemara. Abaya then goes on to say that if a Talmid Chacham wants to go and marry a woman, and he wants to do the mitzvah of Kiddushin with a particular woman, then in such a case, Nidbar Am Haaretz Bahadeh, he should take an Am Haaretz with him, a person who isn't a Talmid Chacham, a person who's not that spiritual and religiously conscious and aware, to check the woman, to make sure that the woman who is later presented to him is in fact the woman that he was Mekadesh under the chuppah. So, in those days, not under the chuppah. A little bit like the case of Lavan in the recent parsha. Are we going to help him be sure that the woman who comes to him later on in marriage was the woman he betrothed? To do that, he'd better check the woman out. In those days, they got married without having seen the woman that many times beforehand. And once again, it could be that he didn't take careful notice. So Abaya advises him to have a regular person there who's not a Talmid Chacham, to be able to see the woman, take notice of her features, so that later on he can say, if there was any doubt in his mind, was this really the woman that I gave the ring to and that I betrothed? She was so gorgeous and so beautiful when I did that. Now she looks a little plain. And the person who's with him could say, no, this is the woman. It's just her presentation is a little bit different. That's what Abaya says. There are two questions that we have over here. The first question is, it seems that there's a double standard. So the Talmid Chacham, no, he can't look at women. That's not the right thing to do. He shouldn't be looking at a woman carefully. Why don't you get an Am Haaretz? Why don't you get somebody else who isn't on that kind of spiritual level to look at the woman? One way or another. If it's not permitted to look at a woman, or to look at her beauty, to gaze at a woman, then it should be the same for a Talmid Chacham and an Am Haaretz. How can he employ the services of an Am Haaretz to help him certify that this is actually the woman that he betrothed? And secondly, we have a Gemara in Kiddushin where Rav Yehuda says in the name of Rav, the Rebbe of Rav Yomi BAVA, in fact, where Rav says, don't marry a woman without seeing her before. Asur la'adam she'ikadesh et ha'isha ad she'irayna. It's a Gemara we had back in Kiddushin and Daf Mem Aleph. It's not permitted to marry a woman that you haven't seen beforehand. Why? Shema yir'eh ba'davar meguneh alav, in case he later on, he's introduced to the woman online, he's introduced to the woman a long distance, and the first time they meet is under the chuppah. He gets married, he hasn't seen her beforehand, and now there are things about her appearance that just irritate him. And then he could be not mekayim the mitzvah of the ahavta l'reacha kamocha. There's a mitzvah that you've got to love your neighbor as yourself. That applies to husbands and wives as well. It's not only to strangers. You've got to at least love your wife as yourself. She's got to love her husband as herself. Just because of the general mitzvah. It's not a law of marriage. This is just an interpersonal law of Jewish people be caring about each other and loving each other. But if you're stuck in a relationship with somebody that irritates you, it's very difficult to be mekayim, to fulfill that mitzvah of loving your neighbor as yourself. So as to avoid that possibility, Rav advises, check her out first. So we see quite clearly it's okay, it's permitted to look at a woman for the purposes of marriage. And so in the case that Abai is talking about in our Gemara, where a man wants to check out that the wife who comes to him at the chuppah is the same woman that he betrothed, in those days it was a year before, surely it's permitted to look at the woman. Why would that not be permitted? So those are the two questions. Why do there seem to be two standards? And why does it appear that the Talmud Chacham is not allowed to look at this woman when Rav says explicitly in Kiddushin that one has to look at a woman before one marries her? To understand this, we're going to look at two views, a machlokes between the Rambam and the Rivad. And here we go to Hilchot Isurei Biyah, Perek Kaf Aleph, Halacha Gimel. And there the Rambam says that mutar listakel bifnei hapnuya levadka ben betula ben beula. If a woman is unmarried, whether she has been previously married or not, it's permitted to look at her, to notice her, to see her features. So that he can decide whether he's attracted to her. Attractiveness is an important part of a relationship. And he needs to feel comfortable with this woman, wanting to be with her, attracted to her. And you can only know that through visual connection. And so says the Rambam, it's proper, based on the Gemara in Kiddushin, to see the woman. Ve'en b'zeh isur, and not only is there no prohibition in this respect, says the Rambam, ela shira'ui la'asot ken. That's the right thing to do. However, the Rambam adds, aval lo yistakel derech zunut, but he isn't permitted to look at the woman in a way of immorality, in a way that is undermining of her, in a way that is sexual. Harehu omer brit karati le'inai huma etbonein al betula. The Rambam quotes the posuk from Eov in chapter Lamed Aleph, where Eov says, I don't know why all these terrible things are happening to me. I'm so meticulous. I've even made a deal with my eyes not to look even at an unmarried woman. I don't do that. And so you see from there, says the Rambam, that to look at a woman as a sexual object is not permitted. It's demeaning for her femininity, and for everything that she stands for and is. It objectifies her, and that's something we're not permitted to do. It's only when one is doing that in order to fulfill the mitzvah of loving your neighbor as yourself, in order to fulfill the mitzvah of marriage, that one isn't objectifying her as a sexual object. One is, on the contrary, creating the circumstance for a kiddushin, a holy marriage, to take place, and that's perfectly in order. Says the Rivad, interestingly enough, based on our Gemara. Doesn't our Gemara say that if a man wants to check out the woman he's betrothing to make sure that when she's presented to him under the chuppah, it's in fact the same woman, he should take somebody who isn't a Talmid Chacham, he should take an ordinary person, an Am Haaretz, an unlearned, and somebody who's not as righteous, take him along to check her out, and to confirm later on at the chuppah that it's the same woman, because he's not going to look carefully enough. So you see from there that even for that purpose, there's no circumstances under which a truly pious person should look at a woman, even if it's for the purpose of marriage. Now, of course, this Rivad is very difficult. Firstly, what do we do with the Gemara in Kiddushin, where the Rav says you should look at the woman before marriage? And secondly, why would you be permitted to have the person who isn't a Talmid Chacham look at the woman if looking at a woman is not something that should be allowed, something which is forbidden? So let's try and understand the difference between the machlokes, between the Rambam and the Rivad. What I would suggest to you is that the Rambam sees this issue from the perspective of the woman. That is, don't objectify the woman. Don't demean the woman by turning her into a sexual object instead of an equal, holy individual capable of engaging into a relationship of kiddushin. And therefore what's important is your intention, the inner place from which you're coming. If you're coming from a place of sexuality, that is demeaning. If you're coming from a place of marriage and wanting to build relationship and connection, that is something of kedusha. Here we're talking on the very fine level of just looking at a woman, and today, of course, we're way beyond that, not necessarily for good reason, but that's where society is. But we have the same kind of issue. If a man is taking a woman out and takes her out on a date, takes her out to dinner, and his intention is to build a relationship which will develop into marriage, then that's a fine thing to be doing. But if a man is using the woman for his own company, companionship, and even worse, for purposes of sexuality, that's demeaning for the woman. That's converting the woman into some kind of an object to be used, almost a prostitute, so to say. And so the inner place from which we come is important. If one is engaging with a woman with the serious intention of exploring marriage possibilities, says the Rambam, that's an elevation of the relationship. If you're gazing at a woman for one's own pleasure, with no intention of marriage, that is something which isn't allowed under any circumstances. So the difference that the Rambam makes between the Gemara in Kiddushin, where you need to check a woman out before you marry her, and our Gemara, where we see that lav uchad tuba mirabonon, it's not the way of a Talmud Chacham, the Meidach, to look carefully at women. The one is talking about a situation where you're looking at for the purpose of marriage, and the other is talking about a situation where you're looking out for your own pleasure. And the issue around, what about then in our Gemara, the case of the man who's checking that this is the same woman, after all, that's for purposes of marriage. Why does Abaya say you should bring another person? Well, the Maggid Mishnah deals with that and goes into that in quite some detail. But what about the Rivad's view? The Rivad's view is different. The Rivad sees it from the perspective of the man, the sanctity of the man, the damage it does to a man to gaze at a woman for sexual purposes. There is an imagery that takes place. There's an image. It's a powerful image because it employs all the sexual urges of the man. And that image becomes intense, and that image creates imagination. That image creates something within him that is ongoing. So there the Rivad says, if the person is a pious man, a Talmid Chacham, he's not accustomed to seeing women. If he sees a woman, even for good reasons, that image is burnished into his mind, and he can't get that image out of his mind. He's very sensitive. If a young man grows up in the streets of Los Angeles, where I've just spent a little bit of time again, wonderful to be there and to meet with wonderful talmidim of the Matmonim and other friends, but we know that Los Angeles is also a place where a person's mind can be sullied and contaminated by the enormous power of the images that are thrown at one in that particular city at certain times of the year. And those images stay with one. It's very difficult to get rid of them. We see that very clearly in the posuk that the Rambam quotes from Eov, and the way it's treated by the Avos de Rabbi Nosson's Pirkei Avot, and by Rashi on Eov. So Pirkei Avot says, Minayin she'asa Eov siag lidvarav. Avos de Rabbi Nosson is speaking about the piece in Pirkei Avot about a person should always make a siag, should build a fence to avoid coming close to doing anything wrong. And Eov was one of the people who did so, and the Avos de Rabbi Nosson quotes this very posuk. Brit kariti le'enai ma, I've made this deal with my eyes not to look at anybody. Ma'im betula shehi mutzeret lihinaseh. I don't even look at an unmarried girl who I could marry. L'chol mi she'titzeh, she can marry whoever she wants. She's available. I still don't look at such a woman. Ilu nimtzeti mistakel ba ki ilu nimtzeti mistakel ba'eshet ish. Because I would consider that as if I'm gazing at somebody else's wife. That's the fence I've made for myself, that I don't distinguish between a married or an unmarried woman. I don't gaze at any woman. And Rashi on Pirkei Avot is interesting, explaining this Avodah Rabbi Nosson adds, I don't look even at an unmarried woman, Shema la'achar yamin tinaseh. In case afterwards she gets married to somebody else, v'nimtzeti karuch achareha, and I find myself lusting after her, and now she's somebody else's wife. And you can ask yourself, well, why do that? Why lust after her? She's got married. Just move on. But that's not so easy. Once there's been an image, once one has been exposed to an image, that image might be very temporary. That image might move on. But the imagination continues with a life of its own. And that applies to negative things such as this. How careful we've got to be at what we look at, because it burns an image into our mind, into our memory, into our imagination. It becomes part of who we are. It's not something you can undo afterwards. That's what seeing does. And so our only choice is to choose what we see, to choose what we expose ourselves to choose what we expose our children to, whether it's in real life or it's on computers or phones or television, movies, to be really careful about the images that one allows one's children to see. Not only sexual images of violence, images of uncouthness, images of bad language, images of husbands and wives, men and women treating each other badly. Those are all images that sit in the person's subconscious forever. And so we can be careful about what we choose to see, what we expose ourselves to. But on the other hand, it can be used so positively. When we're exposed to something that is beautiful, whether it's nature, I'm sitting out in nature at the moment, as you can see in Arizona, United States, and one exposes oneself to nature, that stays with one. If you look at a beautiful work of art, something which is beautiful, not ugly, that stays with one. That's something that becomes part of one's being. We think that seeing is just a fleeting moment. You saw something and it's gone. No, you saw something and it stays. And our responsibility as people of Kedusha is to be cautious about what we allow ourselves to see, to try and eliminate as much of that which is ugly and that which is demeaning as we possibly can, and to elevate ourselves by surrounding ourselves with images of beauty and of sanctity.